And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Molly to start us off.
Great, thanks Brittany, and welcome everyone. I'm excited today to talk about establishing a common language with communication and outreach strategies for working with students experiencing homelessness. So I want to take a few minutes to do introductions. If you could go ahead and post in the chat your name and your organization or agency or school that you're working with, would love to see that. And as you're doing that, I will go ahead and introduce myself. As Brittany mentioned, I'm Molly and I work at the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support with Brittany as a workforce research coordinator. Prior to coming to ICSPS, I worked at a homeless shelter for families. And then prior to that, I did some graduate work around homelessness and worked in high schools in McKinney-Vento programs. So I'm very passionate about working to connect, especially youth who are experiencing homelessness, with resources to succeed in school and in finding housing and resources. So excited to talk about that today. And I'm loving seeing all of your introductions come through. I see we have a really wide variety of people from various colleges and agencies throughout the state. So welcome to everyone. Please continue introducing yourselves, and I'm excited to continue today's session. Today we'll be reviewing some basic demographic information regarding youth who are experiencing homelessness within community colleges and universities. We'll do a brief policy review, which will be a review of the last webinar in this series, which was on the McKinney-Vento Act. We'll talk about some common language and outreach strategies, what to do once a student is identified as experiencing homelessness, and then some resources. And I'll give a lot of different examples throughout these slides today. As Brittany mentioned, the presentation will be posted. Additionally, at the very end of this presentation, I have a website which shares all of the links I go over. So don't worry, during the session, you'll have access to all of the links and examples that I share, and you'll get those at the end of the session today. So I want to start with a story. I really like stories. And this is, I change names when I tell stories, but this is Jenna's story. And I'm sure many of you have stories as well from working at students, from when you just see your work really come to life and come full circle. And this is one of those stories for me. So I want to share the story of Jenna. I mentioned this briefly, but my first job out of college, out of undergrad, was I worked in Detroit, Michigan, in the public schools there. And I would simply go to school lunches or go to school events. And I would start just by talking to students. So I was contracted through a community action agency, and I would go to school lunches and I'd have resources and worksheets and programs and information for students. And the goal was to identify students who were experiencing homelessness, to connect them to supports and additional educational resources. But as many of you may know from working with various students, to share something that personal as your housing situation with someone that you don't know, it's not always a first conversation. So as I was at these lunches, I just kind of get to know students, get to know what they were doing in school and learn a little bit more about them. And I met Jenna, and Jenna would come over to the table I was sitting at every single day at lunch and would be really quiet. And she would just kind of be around, and we'd try to talk to her and just ask her how her day was going, how school was going. She was 18 years old, we found out, and she wouldn't really say much, but she would always kind of be around. So we thought there was a little more to the story. After about probably 4 weeks of her coming by every day, and she would take, some of our free resources that were out. She disclosed that she really was interested in doing social work. And so she was asking us about sort of our journeys in social sciences, and she had pieced together that we were all in the social services field and was asking a lot of questions. And eventually, one of my colleagues asked her, so what inspired you? What made you want to become a social worker? And she disclosed to us that she was caring for her siblings while her mom was working overnight shifts, that their housing situation was constantly changing, and they were moving from foreclosed home to foreclosed home. In Detroit at that time, it was not uncommon for there to be many abandoned homes in this area, and various people would live in them when they could find them. So this was, a sign to all of us. We found out that Jenna was not receiving any services for a student who is experiencing homelessness. So we were able to connect her and we're able to help her with the FAFSA, and she was able to get funding for college and go on to school to start a social work program. I share this story because this was something that took many weeks to find out, and we didn't really even know. We kind of thought she was coming over because she was really interested in some of the resources we had, but we didn't know her story. So today we're going to talk about how to connect with students like Jenna, identify their housing situation, and then connect them to resources and close that loop. Start with just some basic demographic information, just to look at the percentage of students who are experiencing homelessness at the community college level, and then and other barriers to completing their degrees. So there is a survey that was conducted over the course of several years. It's called the Real College Survey. 167,000 students from 171 community college and 56 four-year colleges were surveyed. And these happen to be the results from 2019. This survey found that 17% of students surveyed were homeless from 2019 to 2020. And it also found that there were demographic disparities in terms of the students who were experiencing homelessness. So Black students were higher at a 20% more than their white peers, and Indigenous, as well as Indigenous students. So there were demographic disparities there. They also found that housing insecurity was higher among two-year institution students versus the four-year institution students. And this graph here on the left really displays, oops, I spoke too soon. Sorry about that. This graph here on the left displays some of those differences between two-year and four-year institutions. So as you can see in terms of food insecurity, which are, I'll use my mouse, they're these columns right here. Food insecurity was slightly higher among two-year institutions. Housing insecurity was slightly higher, and homelessness was also slightly higher. And this is among the years from 2015 to 2019. This is from that same survey. Again, two-year institutions on the left, four-year on the right. And they looked at a various number of barriers that students may face as they're looking at housing insecurity. Anything from, have you had a hard time paying your rent, to did you not pay your full amount of rent, or did you miss a utility payment? Have you moved 3 to 4 times, or have you left a household that felt unsafe? So as you'll see, we had about 23% of students at two-year institutions who had difficulty paying rent, about 22% who did not pay their full amount of rent, and then 22% who did not pay their full amount of utilities. And I really wanted to highlight that there because that's nearly a quarter of students who were surveyed who were facing housing insecurity. And even with utilities, it's, a student could live somewhere, but they could not have heat in the winter. And that's just not a stable housing situation. So it's really important that these students are identified so that they're able to get additional assistance. And I believe this is my last chart that I have just to display some of this demographic information. There are also gender differences and sexual orientation differences in students experiencing homelessness found from these surveys. So what they found is that males experienced homelessness at a higher percentage than females. However, students who identified as non-binary, transgender, or transgender experienced it much higher than students who identified as male or female. So that's something to be very mindful of. Additionally, students who identified as heterosexual experienced homelessness at about 16% of respondents versus students who described themselves as gay or lesbian, gay or lesbian or bisexual were identified as homeless at higher percentages again. So these are just things to keep in mind as you are working with students, that it's not, clear cut. There are demographic disparities and demographic differences in terms of the students who are being identified. I just want to do a really quick policy review. And as I mentioned, this is a review from the last webinar in the series a couple of weeks ago regarding McKinney-Vento. And so we'll just go over a couple of different policies that may be affecting some of the students that you're working with, just to frame our conversation today. As we discussed in the last presentation, there's the McKinney-Vento Act, which is largely applying to the high school students. So the students that who are applying to your colleges, universities, or programs. McKinney-Vento describes a student as homeless if they are lacking fixed, adequate, and regular housing. Now that definition feels a little fluid, and that's the point. So, adequate housing could mean, like we just talked about, not having utilities. So someone could be living in a home, they could actually have a home, a structure, but have no heat, no water. That would qualify that student as homeless. So if a student is identified as homeless under McKinney-Vento, it is required that that student has the ability to remain in their school of origin, so the school that they were in prior to becoming homeless. It's required that they have transportation to and from school, that they have access to programs and services that their peers would also have access to. And it also requires that school districts, school regions have a McKinney-Vento liaison. So that is someone who students who are experiencing homelessness can go to for assistance or who can help with identification. Another policy that you'll find that your students may experience or may find useful in the community college for your institution world is the College Cost Reduction Act. So this act applies to FAFSA, and it is for students who are under 21 years old and who are in high school at the time of their FAFSA application. So this would be your seniors in high school who are completing their FAFSA application to begin school the following semester. And what this allows students to do is it allows students who are identified as experiencing homelessness to apply for FAFSA funding, but not have a requirement to include their parent or guardian's financial information. And the way that works is they will be filing their FAFSA as an independent versus a dependent. The way this happens, and we're going to go over this a little bit more later, is that a person certifies their homeless situation. That person can be a homeless liaison from their school district, an emergency shelter program director, a runaway or homeless youth program director, or a college financial aid administrator. And that's what we'll discuss a little bit later is working with your financial aid team at your university or college to identify students. And finally, as some of your students are over the age of 21, I wanted to review as well the HUD definition of homelessness. This is the definition from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. An adult is considered homeless if they are living in a place not meant for human habitation, for example, a gas station, a train station, etc. People who will be losing their primary nighttime residence within the next 14 days. Families with children who are unstably housed. And again, if there's a child, the child's definition of homelessness would fall under McKinney-Vento. And then individuals who are fleeing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other dangerous situations. We're going to go into about 5 different outreach strategies in the next little while, but I want to start with a chat. I want to learn from you. How does your institution or organization conduct outreach to identify students experiencing homelessness? Or how do you connect with them? And I just want to give this a minute to share some of the ideas or some of the things that you're already doing in the chat box. I'll give it about 20 more seconds and then we'll keep moving. I see Trisha just posted that they connect with homeless youth agencies through social service meetings and youth commission meetings. That's a great idea, Trisha. I know many areas have what's called a continuum of care, which is a monthly, weekly, whatever the region decides, meeting of all of the social service providers who assist individuals who are homeless. And that can be a really good resource for connecting and making sure that you have good referrals. So I love that idea. Jen noted that they have a campus food pantry. Participants are asked to self-identify using Perkins Special Pops criteria. Then contact is made by the college counselor to share resources. That's a great idea. That is such a good idea. I've been hearing about different universities and colleges having food pantries for their students, and that's just a wonderful idea. Thank you so much for sharing. Would love to hear other ideas. Feel free to keep updating the chat as we go on. First, we're going to talk about outreach within the classroom. So this is going to apply largely to the instructors working within colleges and universities. So a really good way to work with instructors to help and assist with identifying students experiencing homelessness is to provide training. You know, instructors have so much they're keeping in their mind, from planning lessons to syllabi, etc. So providing that training can be really helpful. And we'll talk about a few resources to find that training in just a few minutes. Another idea is to include language within the syllabus that states that if you do not know where you're staying tomorrow night, or you're lacking stable housing, please do let me know, or contact this other person like the Dean of Students to let them know. We'll also be going over some specific language in just a moment regarding that. An idea is a welcome survey. So a welcome survey is like a first day of school syllabus day, sort of get to know you survey, where you can ask students questions to get to know them better. And you can include a question about housing situation on that survey. Another example is a campus resource list that could be included, right within the syllabus, or just be easily accessible for students who are taking classes, with the various resources that are available for students, like the food pantry that Jen mentioned. And then a final idea is to ask for required office hours. So requiring that students meet with you as a professor or an instructor at least once over the course of the semester to, you can talk about your educational goals or other things, but including a question in those hours that identify if the student is lacking any resources. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. I'm actually going to share right now what I just described to you, this campus resource list. I have an example, so let me just share my screen really quickly. Okay. So you might see this LaGuardia Cares. This is a community college in New York, and they have a LaGuardia Cares program. So for their students, it stands for College Access for Attention and Economic Success. So for their students, they have this website where students can see if they qualify for benefits in terms of getting help paying for college or basic living expenses, learning if they're a veteran or if they need financial assistance. And then they list this they created this comprehensive list of different resources available on campus. So like Jen mentioned, they have a food pantry, they have a clothing closet, they offer services to getting students connected to healthcare and legal services. What really stood out to me was their community resource list. So you can click food assistance and see all of the food assistance available to students in their New York region. You can click, let's see here, faster access to unemployment, and they have a list here, health guidance, and they have different healthcare providers listed here. So I just wanted to share this as an example of a resource list that could be provided to students as just a link on the syllabus that they had access to. Okay, I'm going to open back up the presentation. I'll be switching between these two a little bit throughout our time here. So just bear with me as I switch. Okay. I mentioned we were going to talk about some training ideas for faculty and instructors. And these are just some ideas of resources that already exist out there. You can, I know a community college that does training for their instructors on regarding teaching online, as many classes have moved to online, especially last year. So as a part of that online teacher training course for their faculty, they build in one day or 1 hour of the training that discusses working with students who are facing barriers such as homelessness. So if you already do a training for instructors, it could be a good opportunity to just build some of this content into that training that already exists. Another idea for training is to use these CTE special populations recorded webinars and I'll just share them with faculty and instructors to watch on their own time. ISB has workshop materials around working with students who are experiencing homelessness, which I'll share with you again in just a moment. And so just using some of their materials they already have created is a really good opportunity. You could contact your local homeless shelter and ask them if they have someone available to provide some training. I know I worked in development at a homeless shelter, and the homeless shelter I worked at was located really near Michigan State University and also a community college. And we would often get calls from instructors to come out and give a presentation to a class or a group of faculty. And I think it varies by shelter, but it was something that we either had a recorded session that we could just send to them to use, or one of us would be able to help out. So they might be a good resource to try. You can contact your McKinney-Vento liaison to see if they provide training in your region. I know Julie Radican did our last session on the McKinney-Vento Act, and she is a McKinney-Vento liaison, and she does trainings all the time for faculty, instructors, high school teachers, so that could be a resource. And then finally, there's NACCE, which is the National Alliance for the Education of Homeless Youth and Children. Homeless Children and Youth, I'm sorry, I did the wrong order of the acronym. And they have many, many resources available as well. I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to switch over to share my screen to some tabs again, some resource tabs that I just described so that you can see them. And again, you'll get all of these later. So do not worry too much about finding these because you'll get all of these later. Okay. So this is NACCE. This is the National Alliance for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth, and they have this whole tab that discusses higher education. They have a section which describes the laws that are applicable. They have resources that are for financial aid administrators that talk about going to college from a student's perspective who is experiencing homelessness. So they have many different resources that you can use as you're trying to provide your faculty and instructors with what they need to be able to identify students who are experiencing homelessness. I also pulled up this letter from the Illinois State Board of Education discussing supporting homeless students during the 2020-2021 year. And this is another resource you can use to send to faculty and instructors. Okay, switching back to our PowerPoint. I mentioned in the syllabus to include some sort of basic needs statement or a statement of what students should do if they are lacking permanent housing. So to include a statement like this in a syllabus, there are 4 steps which I laid out up here. First, to normalize seeking help and make that clear to students right away. Never calling out homelessness, framing it more if students are seeking help. A student may not consider themselves homeless. They may consider themselves couch surfing, or they may consider themselves moving a lot. So to use the word homeless may be a word that a student doesn't identify them as, even if it would qualify them to receive additional resources. Direct students toward help, such as a dean of students, and provide a connection to you. So here I have a basic needs statement, an example from an instructor, which this was provided from the University of Virginia. So that's there for you to use in the future. It'll also be on the list of resources I provide later. I also mentioned instructors and faculty could use a welcome survey to get to know students. And so this was something when I was working in high schools, this was something we often did, and it was multi-purpose. It was first just to get to know our students, get to know if they needed accommodations or what they were hoping to learn. But this is also a great way to give students an opportunity to disclose if they need additional help. So here we have a list from the Hope Center. They list some sample questions that you could use in a welcome survey, from preferred name and pronouns to gender identity to what are some of your responsibilities outside of class To down here, you see, where are you living? If campus closes, do you have a plan of where to go? Like this can provide a great way to identify students who need additional resources, and just encouraging faculty that if they do identify that, to be sure to connect those students with the dean of students or whoever provides and links students with what they need at your institution. Okay, we're going to go into our next section now. We just talked about outreach within the classroom. Now we're going to talk about outreach in a financial aid setting. I mentioned the FAFSA allows for students to identify as independent or file as independent on their FAFSA, which allows them better access to funding and a little bit easier access if they don't have all of the documentation requirements that are needed. Two ways that students are identified as experiencing homelessness on the FAFSA are the questions, which address do I use, and do I file as independent? So if a student comes to a financial aid administrator or employee at your institution and asks and seems to be confused about the address they're going to use or their dependency status, this is a really good way to talk to your financial aid staff and just let them know what the process is, or if they're able to sense if that student may need additional assistance and resources. This can come through having that campus resource list they can easily refer students to, or knowing that the referral process is to refer to the dean of students, for example. Another idea for students or for financial aid to do some outreach is to offer money management classes and make that available to all students or all incoming students, just to discuss some of these money management issues that may come up for students, whether or not they're experiencing homelessness. Additionally, something really helpful is students who are, I was actually just talking to someone the other day who was experiencing homelessness at the time of attending community college, and they didn't know they could mark themselves as an independent on the FAFSA. And so their mom ended up taking out loans for them, and then mom withheld some of the money. And this was many years ago, but they didn't know that was an option. So providing FAFSA classes at local high schools or in local community centers to help incoming students with that and let them know that there are options for them in terms of filing for FAFSA, even if they don't have parental or guardian support. And just to go over some of those FAFSA identification questions. Areas where a student may identify as lacking permanent housing would be when they're asked for their permanent mailing address, and then in the dependency status question. So there's a chunk of questions that ask about dependency status, including, have you been emancipated? Do you have a legal guardian? Have you been identified as an unaccompanied youth by your district McKinney-Vento liaison? Or have you been identified as homeless from an emergency shelter, a local emergency shelter? If a student answers yes to any of those questions, they're able to file as independent and as a youth that is either unaccompanied or experiencing homelessness. Other questions that maybe a student may come to a financial aid administrator and be confused about if they are experiencing homelessness is the number of people in their household. So if students are moving around households a lot, staying with friends, staying wherever they can find, they might not be able to know what number of people to put in their household because their household situation isn't stable. Additionally, there is a section that asks for signatures, and if they're not sure who to get signatures from, this could also be an area just to see if they need additional resources. I put a few links here, which you'll have access to later. There is a wonderful resource from NAEYC, which describes, it takes the financial aid or the FAFSA forms, and it breaks down all of the questions that could possibly identify a student as experiencing homelessness, and also brings up some common questions that financial aid administrators receive from students regarding those. So I really encourage you to look at that on your own time. It's really helpful. Okay, so I'm going to do a poll question because I think this would be really interesting to learn. Does your institution provide training for financial aid staff and or instructors on working with students experiencing homelessness? And let me just launch this poll. You should be able to see it now. Also, we're at about the halfway point in the presentation. So if you, and we've gone through a lot so far, so if you want to take a moment and ask any questions that have come up, please feel free to post those in the chat, and I can take a pause to answer some questions right now as well. I'll give about 10 more seconds on the poll. Perfect. So it looks like about 3 participants said your school does, and about 13 said your school does not. So please, feel free to refer to some of the resources here and in the links that I provide at the end if you're looking to do something like that. There are resources that have already been created, so you don't have to reinvent the wheels yourself. Okay. And like I said, please feel free to post questions in the chat as we go along. I'm happy to answer. So we've covered outreach within the classroom, outreach within the financial aid office. Now we're going to talk about outreach within high schools. And this is really important because this is where many of your students are coming, is out of high school. As I mentioned, when I was working in high schools, a great way just to identify which students could use additional resources in many capacities was at school lunch. I was a part of a program, as I mentioned, and we had staff who would just sit at a table at school lunch. We're really fortunate to get a lot of donations from the community in terms of things like hygiene items, toothbrushes, notebooks, backpacks, things of that nature. So we'd have those out, students would come over and get what they needed, but a lot of times it was just discussing. So we would do everything from just chat with students to have resources and referrals to different college visits to help with homework and just to have that connection to a community agency. There's been a lot of research done that shows that students who are going through and facing some of these barriers do much better when they're connected with an agency or organization. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, having FAFSA and info sessions at high schools are great. They're huge because the FAFSA can be really overwhelming. I think it's overwhelming personally. And, I went to school and filled it out. So it's just a really helpful thing to have. Things like on-site admissions can be really helpful. There's often application fees associated with applying to different programs or colleges. And so if your college has the ability to do on-site admissions, especially at schools in your area who do have a higher proportion of students who are receiving free and reduced lunch, for example, that can be really helpful where you come in for a day and have like 20 minutes with each student. They fill out your application and you can do admissions right on site. I know there are a few schools or state universities that do that I'm familiar with, and that was really helpful to students when we were working in high schools. Having mentorship programs. So if you have students at your community college who are formerly homeless or formerly within the foster care system, and there's students who are involved and engaged, that could be a mentor to an incoming student so that they're connected. Again, the more you can be connected with the district McKinney-Vento liaisons, the better. They have resources within their districts and they are looking to connect their students with any opportunities. So being as connected to them as possible is great. Hosting college visit days, for students to be able to come to your campus, see what it's like, get to know people. If you can provide transportation, that's even better. And then finally, posters. Posting posters within high schools, which I have some poster templates that I'll share with you, just that say things like, do you know where you're staying tonight? If not, here are some steps you can take. Or are you looking to go to college but not sure how to fill out the FAFSA? Here are some steps, just so students know that those are options for them. I see we just had a question in the chat box. Can a student experiencing homelessness under 21 apply to FAFSA as independent if staying at a homeless shelter with a parent, or because it's with a parent, still need a parent's information? So that is a really good question. I'm going to need to get back to you on that because I know that that applies if the student is an unaccompanied youth staying at a homeless shelter, but it might be different if they are still with their parent at a family shelter situation. So I'm going to find out for you and I will, Brittany, I'm not sure the best way to get back to them. I know we have another session in a couple weeks, so I can say that then, or is there a better way?
Yeah, or Evelyn, if you want to put, I can send out my email address and Molly's email address, and if you want to contact us that way, or if it's a question that everyone on the call is kind of curious to the answer as well, I can, once Molly finds that out, I can include that in our follow-up email that'll go out to everyone who attended, along with the recordings and the slides. So we can do it in multiple ways.
Perfect. Thank you, Brittany. But that was a great question. Thank you very much for asking it. I wanted to talk a little bit more about school lunches, or, you can do outreach at high schools in many ways. Maybe it's school lunches, maybe it's going to sports games, maybe it's going to school festivals. This is just an example I use as lunches. So the benefits of doing outreach at high schools are, first, you can help them with meeting their basic needs. So if you can bring hygiene items, or if you can bring connections to local resources, like you have that resource list, then that's really helpful. Something that was really a big part of when we were doing outreach at high schools was mandated reporting. And just being aware of that, especially as you're doing outreach with students, is students would sometimes reveal, while homelessness was not a reason for mandated reporting, they would sometimes reveal that they needed to leave their housing situation due to violence or due to something that was not safe for them. And so that we did have to do some mandated reporting. So just being aware of that with the staff that is doing outreach events is important. Again, it's helpful to work on FAFSA and offer FAFSA resources. Something that was fun that we did with students was a question of the day, just to sort of break the ice. So it might be like, what's your plan? Or I was going to say, what's your plan for when you leave high school? But that's that's a lot for someone. Maybe it's, what's something interesting you learned today? There's an awesome discussion guide. It's so good. It's right here, and it will be in your resource packet. It's from the NCHE, which is an organization which helps with the education of children who are experiencing homelessness. And they give you all sorts of ways to discuss college and CTE options for students who are experiencing homelessness, and really lay out the best way to have those conversations. Additionally, when doing outreach, a really helpful thing is to have an intake form. So just have a form where you have students sort of fill out their name and their email address, or a way to contact them, so that if they do have questions or they do want to learn more, you have their information to contact them. I wanted to give another story example, just to sort of illustrate, the impact of outreach and things of that nature. So we had a student named Robin, and Robin was a football player and very passionate about football, very excited about football. Whenever Robin's friends would talk, they'd just say Robin was going to go be a football player, really famous football player. And we noticed that he always kind of looked, I don't know, when people would say that, you could just tell there was a look on his face that was kind of disappointed. He was pretty quiet again. So after several weeks, we had already known that Robin was experiencing homelessness. His housing situation was unstable. So we had been working with him. And so we had assumed, because of the way everyone talked and he didn't ever say anything different, that he was planning to focus his efforts on football. He shared with us that he wanted to open his own restaurant. That was his desire. He wanted to open a barbecue restaurant, and that's what he really wanted to do. And again, through this outreach program and through connections with local community college, he was actually able to take a hospitality class at the local community college his second semester of senior year, and try out that profession, and then go on to go to that community college. And that was just another powerful example of connection. And he was able to get connected to other students who were at the community college during his time there as a student during high school, which just made his transition there so much easier. So that was a really cool thing to see. Okay, so we're going to do a final section, which is outreach within the community. And I put this picture there because it is not my favorite picture of me, but I put this picture here because when I worked for a community action agency, we did a lot of outreach in the community, or the action agency did. I was filling in for someone this day, but I wish I got to be a penguin all the time. But there was a lot of outreach that was done in the community around just making people aware that there are services and opportunities for individuals experiencing homelessness, especially youth, because it's not something we all talk about all the time. So this was the lovely Puddles the Penguin, and Puddles the Penguin would go around the Detroit area and raise awareness around keeping people warm and keeping people warm within shelter, within with utility assistance. And so Puddles would go to different community events and share resources and connections. So that's kind of an extreme example of having a giant penguin. But the point is to have, it's not a bad idea to do outreach within your communities. So you can do outreach within your communities at libraries, maybe offering these FAFSA classes at libraries. Posting posters and different signs in areas of public transportation. That's a common or other frequently visited areas like laundromats. Attending community events and festivals, which I'm sure many of your colleges already do. Offer outreach classes, either virtually or in person. So maybe I've seen where people offer like a English 101 or some sort of like 2-hour sample class so that people can kind of try out what it's like to go to their institution. And then again, working to be connected with nonprofits, because you can go a lot further when you're going as a team. And we're going to talk all about that specific connecting with local nonprofits in our next session in a couple of weeks. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to go to another resource. I mentioned that there are posters that you can post in areas that are public, as well as areas like public transportation, libraries, high schools. So I want to show you some templates for that, because they are already available to you. You don't need to make them yourself. So these are all from the National Center for Homeless Education. Here's one that talks about if a student is trying to go to college, but they're living without stable housing. And they list some examples of where you might be living. And then if so, you may qualify as an independent student on FAFSA. And then you would put your local contact info. So here's one that's already made for you. Oh, and here's one more. This one just talks about information for school-aged youth and describes how youth could be eligible for additional services under McKinney-Vento. So this is one you might often see in high schools already. I also want to go back. I mentioned a little ways back, and now I can show you the link, that there was a fact sheet with different questions that may come up on the FAFSA that identify students as experiencing homelessness, or could, kind of be markers if students are having issues with that. So here are the questions. Here's the Q&A sheet that you'll get access to later. It's really helpful. It lays out what question number in the FAFSA, what could be the confusion, and then the answer. Okay. I want to do another question in the chat just to get some ideas from you who are doing this work every day. How do you market services or higher education options for students experiencing homelessness throughout your school or in your community? Do you have marketing options? Or I'm sorry, do you market? Yes, too. I'll give us about 30 seconds here to see if we get any responses. And while you're typing in responses, I'm going to answer a question or comment. I see Laura posted in the chat that she has a student who has recently become homeless, and she's having some difficulty finding a place for them to live. And this will be a really good thing that we'll talk about in our next session about connecting with nonprofits and connecting with local community resources for helping to get that student into housing. I know that you're not the only one going through this. Affordable housing is really difficult everywhere right now, and wait lists for subsidized housing, Section 8 housing, supportive housing are really long. So we're going to talk in our next session a lot about how we might connect with nonprofits to find temporary housing in terms of a shelter, but also how maybe through community resources, there might be longer term housing options. And we'll discuss a couple different models. Melissa noted that they have an app where they can send out info to. They use social media and talk about a variety of topics to market their services or provide higher education options for students who are experiencing homelessness. Thank you, Melissa. That's awesome. That's really cool, actually. I've never seen an app like that. If you have a link to the app, we'd love to see it. Oh, and thanks, Brittany. Brittany just posted a link to register for the session where we'll be talking about connecting with nonprofit organizations. And I'll have a lot of models I'll share there of public-private partnerships in terms of doing things just like you mentioned, like helping people find housing. Okay, so our next section we're going to do in the next couple of minutes here is we're going to talk about one, identifying common language for identifying students who are experiencing homelessness, and two, what to do once we identify a student as experiencing homelessness. So I have one more poll. And this poll question is, have you established common language to use when discussing or working with students experiencing homelessness within your organization? So have you had a discussion around what language to use? Will you use the word homeless? Will you use a different word, etc.? I'll give it about 10 more seconds on the poll. Okay, awesome. So it looks like most of you have not, a couple of you have, that's great. Again, we'll talk about some resources that have already been created so that you don't need to reinvent the wheel if you're looking to do this. Okay, so talking about common language. Some common words we might use instead of homeless, because as I discussed earlier, students who may qualify as receiving services for experiencing homelessness would not say to you themselves that they are homeless. So some words that we might use are someone experiencing homelessness. You may have noticed me saying this, you may hear others saying it. It describes someone's situation as something they're experiencing versus if you say like, oh, this student is homeless, it makes it seem like it's part of their identity, which it isn't. There are many other things as well. A question you could ask is, do you know where you'll stay tonight? You could ask, do you have enough food to eat this weekend? Rather than asking questions like, are you homeless? Are you food insecure? You could ask a question like, do you have an address that you sleep at each night? And I see someone posted in the chat that you've started having discussions, but no decision has been made. So these are just some ideas to talk with faculty, staff, others at your institution to kind of get that conversation going is how do you want to ask the questions? What terminology do you want to use, etc. The next thing I want to talk about as we're wrapping up here is what happens when a student is identified. You know, because we don't want the last thing we do in our process to just say, oh, okay, you're experiencing homelessness, great, have a good day. We want to make sure that they're connected to as many resources to succeed as possible. So some questions to ask as you're working on this at your institution is there a single point of contact at your institution? I mentioned that referring to the dean of students or referring to maybe there is a social worker at your school. Who should faculty, staff, financial aid staff contact if they identify a student as homeless to then refer that student to various resources? Do you have a resource list readily accessible? And I have an example showing a little bit. I just saw one in the chat. Yes, Jen posted one in the chat up there a little bit. Is there a warm handoff plan? By that, I mean, when a student does tell you that they are facing housing instability, do you then have a plan for saying like, okay, I'm going to let this person know, and then this person will connect you to what you need, rather than referring them to 10 other people and having it be overwhelming? Are the right people asking the right questions? It could be really traumatic, the reason that a student is experiencing homelessness, and asking them to repeat that story too many times is just reliving the trauma. So, for example, if a student lets a faculty member know that they're homeless, would it be better suited for that faculty member to ask why or for that dean of students to ask why? Probably the dean of students, if the dean of students is going to be the one connecting them to resources. Whoever is going to be the resource connector is going to be the best person to ask, you know, you're experiencing homelessness, like what other resources can I give to you? And the why might not even be necessary all the time. It's just important to not make a student rehash their story over and over and over again. And then finally asking, do you have a homeless education liaison at your school? It's not necessarily required at the college or university level, but do you have someone? Do you want to devote those resources to someone who is specifically assisting students experiencing homelessness? I want to end with just a few best practices and ideas of examples from things that we've seen at other colleges and institutions. What I saw from the Schoolhouse Connection is they suggested partnering with admissions to identify students who write about homelessness in their application essays. So if there is an essay required to be admitted to your program, if admissions finds that a student is talking about their current homeless situation, making sure they know who to refer to for that. There's an example on the left of a referral system that was created by a university, and I have a picture of it there, and they lay out a really clear system to all of their faculty and staff regarding what happens if a student is identified as needing additional assistance. So you can see that based on the photo on the left. So creating a referral system that's used throughout your institution. Additional staff could be trained, so resident assistants, campus police, librarians, these areas where many students visit, providing them with training. And then finally, there's a link at the bottom to a best practices webinar hosted by Schoolhouse Connection. And it's best practices about working with students in higher ed who are experiencing homelessness. And that's a free webinar you can take at any time. So I put that link there. These are some questions you can take back with you to your institution or your school. This presentation will be available. So I just listed a few for you to look at on your own time as you're considering identifying and working with students experiencing homelessness. Oh, Melissa, that's really good to know. Melissa said that she thinks there may be future requirements regarding liaisons at the higher ed level. So that'll be something to be continued. I'll look into that as well. Finally, I want to end with a few resources for you. I'm going to show you a Padlet which lists all of the resources, all of the links that we discussed today. And then also just a note that Hunger and Homeless Awareness Week is November 13th through 21st. They have a toolkit with tons of programs and resources. So if you want to do something to raise awareness at your own school or institution, there are tons of resources on this link. Let me share with you the Padlet, and then I'm going to put it into the chat box as well. Let's see. Okay. So this is the Padlet. This has all of the different links that I discussed today. You can have this to follow up on any of them and use these as you wish for your school or to share with others. So I'm going to copy and paste this and put it in the chat box right now. And I wanted to stop with 5 minutes to spare to be able to answer any questions anyone has. So please post any questions you have in the chat box, and I'm happy to answer those. I also want to make sure I shared with you the best link. I think I did, but I posted it twice just in case. Okay, let's see. Do we have any questions? See any new questions at the moment? Do you have any questions on your end, Brittany?
I do not, but I did notice that Melissa shared the bill that she had mentioned about that potential future requirement for the liaison. So Melissa, thank you for that. I myself clicked on it and will be looking at it here in a bit. And then I did just also want to reiterate too, I believe it was Jen shared a resource as well. So a lot of good resources being shared in the chat. And I believe you guys have the ability to save the chat as well. So any of these resources that have been shared out, you can save this chat. So you have the links to those. And like I had mentioned before, the recording for this webinar, as well as Molly's slide deck with all of the links and everything that she has on there, will be posted to our website. And let me go ahead and get that link again, because I know we had a couple who may have popped in a little bit later and so didn't get it. So bear with me 1 minute here while I get that. And you'll also see on this web link that I'm sending in the chat here The special populations video series that Molly mentioned in her presentation are also linked there, as well as the recording from the first webinar in this series that Julie did for us is also shared there as well. Okay, sorry, trying to talk and navigate a website is apparently not my area of expertise. So there you go. So that's linked in there, and we'll share everything out with you guys when it's all uploaded and ready to go out. So yep, still a bunch of great resources being shared. So please be sure to, I'll give it a second here so you guys can save that chat. Crystal shared a community resource guide from Illinois Valley. So fantastic, awesome. All right, and I am not seeing any other questions on my end. So Molly, unless you have any closing comments there, we want to thank you guys so much for joining us today. Molly, thank you for this wonderful information. And you all will be receiving a follow-up email within the next day or two, again, with the link to all of the resources in case you just didn't happen to snag it here. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.